Well, hi, and welcome back. You've got just me today. Connie's not available for the video. So what we thought we'd do is just keep it real simple today. We want to share with you a segment of a video podcast that we listened to that we found quite fascinating. They talk about the relationship between sunlight and our energy, especially as we age. There's something that they call mitochondrial dysfunction, which means the mitochondria, the little power generators in all of our cells, is how we get our energy. When the mitochondria age, as we get older, in other words, they just lose some of their capacity to generate as much energy. They're saying up to like 60% from day one to day end, last day. So that's considerable. And it's fascinating that they're finding a relationship between sunlight and the ability of the mitochondria to generate energy. It's like being out in the sun, they're seeing, can actually stimulate the mitochondria's energy producing capacity. So we thought we'd share that with you. It's really fascinating how they see all this. So uh, give it a go, and I'll get back to you after the video.
So, of these subjects that you just went through there for this New Start framework, where do you want to start?
I think actually sunlight is one of those things where I'm excited about all of those, but I think sunlight is really where we have let's put it this way, it's the lowest hanging fruit.
Okay. Explain to me why sunlight is the place where your focus is at the moment.
It's a long trip that has gotten me to that.
Okay.
And I think part of it goes right through COVID. So as a critical care intensivist, when I heard that there was this virus that was coming, they all told us that it was going to be people with respiratory illnesses, which I was certainly comfortable with. But that's not what it turned out to be. We certainly saw people with respiratory illnesses, but what we saw in the intensive care unit, the people that were dying around me were people with obesity, people with heart disease, people with kidney disease, people with dementia, people with chronic diseases. And it made me think, why was that the case? All of those things have one thing in common, and many other things too, but specifically, they're rooted in something called mitochondrial dysfunction. So let me unpack that for you. And this has to do with longevity, this has to do with aging. This is a huge topic that is now just emerging, and we're now finding more about this. So when I was in high school biology, when I was in college, we all learned about this little organelle in all of our cells, except for red blood cells, called the mitochondria. And I have to say it, what is the mitochondria? It's the powerhouse of the cell, right? So it's the thing that makes energy. What we didn't know at the time is that as we get older, the output from these batteries in our cells drops by about 70%.
Damn.
Can you imagine running your house on 70% less energy? Well, how fundamentally that would change what happens in your house. Like, you could not run the laundry the same way. You could not run the microwave and the laundry at the same time.
And what does that look like in terms of symptoms?
Excellent question, because what it looks like is, depending on the cell type that we're talking about, that's going to have the issue. So if we're talking about the liver's going to get more fatty. If we're talking about the heart's going to become more congested. If we're talking about the brain, it's going to have more dementia. And so what's happening here is that as we get older, the batteries in our cells are not working the same way as they used to. Metabolism is slowing down. And so these are huge issues. And all of these diseases that I just talked about, all the ones that we saw in COVID, if you look in a lot of these diseases, they are rooted in mitochondrial dysfunction. So the question is why is that the case, and what can we do about it? So there was a paper that came out in 2019 that fundamentally changed the way I saw this. It was written by Russell Reiter, who is the executive editor of Melatonin Research. He's out of University of Texas. And Scott Zimmerman, who's a light engineer. And what they set forth was to show that basically sunlight is made up of so many different types of wavelengths. You've got ultraviolet on one end, which of course makes vitamin D. And it's very beneficial. It's the type of light from the sun that is very short wave, but cannot penetrate very deeply. Now, let me back up a little bit and explain. You pull up to a stop sign, and somebody pulls up next to you, and they're playing the latest hip hop music. How does that sound to you in your car? It's very boom, boom, right?
Yeah, muffled.
Okay. And muffled. And the reason why is because low wave frequency has the ability to travel very far. Go to the Grand Canyon, and there's a thunderstorm at the other end of it. What do you hear? It's like a rumbling. And then as it gets closer, you hear the higher pitched sounds. This is a fundamental physics principle. And so when the sun is shining, there's very short wavelengths, ultraviolet B, involved in vitamin D. But at the other end, there's this infrared light, which we'll talk about, or red light. It's very long wavelength, and it can penetrate very, very deeply. That's very important because what we're talking about is the human body. And if the sun is going to have an effect on the human body, it's got to be more than just the skin. So that's exactly what this paper showed, is that basically the infrared light from the sun is able to penetrate probably up to about 8 centimeters, according to Scott Zimmerman in this article. And it fundamentally interacts with specifically the mitochondria. And what does it do to the mitochondria? So let's back up and talk about the mitochondria, because this is central. The mitochondria to the cell is like the engine in your car. The engine produces locomotion that causes the wheels to spin, but in the process of doing it, it causes heat to surround the engine. And if you don't deal with that heat, it will shut down the engine. It will make it more inefficient, and eventually it will shut it down. So what do all internal combustion engines have? They have a cooling system. They have a radiator. They have an oil pan. They have a water pump. And that's exactly what the cell has to have for the mitochondria. It's not heat in the mitochondria. It's called oxidative stress. And it's specifically oxidative stress that causes destruction and destruction of the mitochondria and leads to these types of diseases. So oxidative stress causes the mitochondria not to work well. This leads to diabetes. Oxidative stress makes the mitochondria not work so well. This leads to dementia. So this has already been laid out. This is not that controversial. The controversial part is, what do we do about it? So what these guys in this paper showed was that, and not just them, but reviewing the literature, is that the mitochondria makes its own cooling system. And that cooling system is melatonin. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, melatonin, isn't that the stuff that we take, that our brain makes right before we go to sleep? Yeah, it's absolutely correct. That's what happens. The problem is that this is not melatonin that's made in the brain. This is not melatonin that goes through the blood supply and goes through our blood and tells us it's time to go to sleep. This is melatonin that's made in the cell, in the mitochondria. And it's a powerful antioxidant that basically prevents the oxidative stress from occurring. What Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder showed and proposed in this was that basically the infrared radiation that's coming in to the body is able to stimulate and upregulate melatonin and a number of other factors that keep the mitochondria cool and can actually improve the energy output of the mitochondria. So this was actually mind-blowing to me. And I'll tell you why I resonated with this as a critical care physician, because there was 2 things that bothered me the most. Number 1, SARS-CoV-2 virus. When it comes into the body, it interacts with something called the ACE2 receptor. You may have heard about the ACE2 receptor. Okay, this is where the virus actually latches on to the cell and gets internalized. So what is this ACE2 receptor? Was this there for all of humanity just to be a receptor, or does it actually have a role? It turns out it actually has a role, and mind-blowingly, the ACE2 receptor is involved in mitigating oxidative stress. So in other words, it's another part of the cell's cooling system for the mitochondria. What's happening is that the virus, when it attaches to the cell, is basically eliminating that action. And so imagine you have a bunch of people with various different engines running at different temperatures, in other words. You've got some people with chronic disease, and we know their engines are running hot. We have other people who are completely healthy, and they're doing quite well. Their engines are nice and cool. They have no problems at all. Now imagine COVID comes, and SARS-CoV-2 is infecting everybody. what that tendency is to do is because it's knocking out everybody's ACE2 receptor, which has the ability to cool down the engine, in other words, it's causing everybody's engine to run hot, right? So in other words, picture is this way: you're driving along in your car and your thermometer is there, and all of a sudden there's this big hill that you have to climb called COVID-19. Who's going to make it over that hill, and who's not going to make it over that hill? The people that make it over the hill are those with great cooling engines whose temperatures are running great. The ones that don't make it over that hill are the ones that have the thermometer on their engine running hot. Those are the ones that poop out at the top and can't make it. And they're the ones pulled over to the side of the road with the hood up and the steam coming out of the engine. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Of course, yeah.
So this makes perfect sense to me why I wasn't seeing what they were predicting, which is these respiratory patients coming into the ICU. Who was I seeing in the ICU? I was seeing people with dementia, as we talked about, diabetes, kidney disease. These are the ones that were sick. The other thing that really hit me and resonated with this was, and this was not even controversial. We knew early on in the pandemic that people who came into the hospital and had higher levels of vitamin D did really well. They didn't die. They didn't have the same chances of dying. People who had low vitamin D levels, they had much higher chances of dying. So we would check these vitamin D levels. And so think about this. You're there at ground zero and you're taking care of these patients and you see this data over and over and over again that vitamin D is very predictive of who's going to die. Obviously, what are you going to do? Even though this is an associative study, that association doesn't mean causation. You're going to be giving people vitamin D and try to get those levels up. The problem is that we gave vitamin D and it really didn't have much of an effect. So
You gave it in supplement tablet form.
when people would come into the hospital.
Like this.
Exactly. Just like that. In fact, I was supplementing myself. I mean, what have you got to lose, right? I already took my vitamin D tablet this morning. That's very hard to overdose, but it's possible.
So you noticed that it was
Yeah.
hard to treat people with vitamin D, but giving them a tablet didn't really do much.
That's correct.
Why?
Well, this is what I believe is the fact, is we saw that people with high levels of vitamin D or normal levels of vitamin D did better than those that had low levels. I believe that was a marker of something else. In other words, people who had higher levels of vitamin D meant that they were out in the sun more. They were outside more than the people that had very low vitamin D levels. The people with low vitamin D levels were telling me these are people that were not getting outside into the sun. And so what's the real factor here? What's doing the heavy lifting? And I would propose, and Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder would propose, and I can tell you a number of other scientists that would agree with me on this, is that infrared radiation from the sun is causing an effect at the mitochondrial level in terms of oxidative stress, and that vitamin D was just the marker of who was getting the infrared light and who was not, who was going outside and who was not going outside. So when the sun is shining, for the most part, you're getting infrared light, you're getting the entire biological spectrum from the sun. We can go to the longest wavelength, which is far infrared, all the way to the shortest wavelength, which is ultraviolet B, okay, which makes vitamin D. So in other words, when you are outside in a natural environment, you're getting a very broad spectrum of light. And so because of that, if you're getting infrared light, you're also going to be making vitamin D.
Yeah.
You're getting both. Now, that can change because in the wintertime, when the sun is lower in the sky, especially in England, this is a special issue at that latitude. When the sun is low in the sky, the light has to penetrate obliquely through the atmosphere. And because of that, shortwave radiation from the sun, like ultraviolet B, does not make it very well. So there's times of the year where you're not getting enough ultraviolet B, or maybe even no ultraviolet B from the sun.
Which makes the vitamin D.
Which makes the vitamin D, and that you're going to be deficient. You need to supplement. However, during that same period of time, when you're not getting enough vitamin D because there's no ultraviolet B radiation, that sun is low, but it's still enough to allow that long wavelength penetrating infrared light to still come through.
Well, there you have it. What did you think? Was that as interesting to you as it was to us? Well, I know I love how science these days is connecting dots that are so subtle, but obviously have an impact. There's a real validity to them. And the interesting thing too is that we don't need science to tell us that this happens. We experience it. You know, when I walk into the sun, I'm a little more energized. I'm a little more like, yeah, let's do something. So it's been there all along, but it's just really cool to understand the mechanics behind it. And the value for me when I hear this kind of science that validates my experience is that it just goes in a little deeper. I just feel a little better to be out in the sun. I feel a little more encouraged to get out in the sun, knowing there are these benefits to doing it. So that's why we like to share this kind of thing with you from time to time. And that's what we've got for you today. Oh, well, we've got one more thing. Of course, we've got a recipe. Our weekly recipe this week is a rice and bean summer salad, which is rice and beans and a wonderful variety of fresh summer veggies to go with it. And we also suggest you can either use salsa to dress it or one of our oil-free dressings that we give you the recipe for as well. So give it a try, see what you think. Let us know if you like it. And we'll be back next week. Thanks a lot.